right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. As always, Benum Christ in it. I greet Christ in you and welcome back. So I'll go ahead and do the share screen here. We are just now beginning our 5th chapter. So finally, after months of grappling with our demons, in chapter 4, we're moving on to, we're putting them behind us for a while and moving on to our practice of meditation itself. So we begin with an opening prayer from St. Augustine. Breathe into me, Spirit of God, that I may think what is holy. Drive me, Spirit of God, that I may do what is holy. Draw me, Spirit of God, that I may love what is holy. Strengthen me, Spirit of God, that I may preserve what is holy. Guide me, Spirit of God, that I may never lose what is holy. Amen. So our first reading will span pages 136 to 37. The first reading is a little long because I was trying to thematically hold together what I'm talking about there rather than break it up over the course of a separate week. So the chapter begins with a quote from Paul Claudel. I believe that the cross will not be satisfied until that point when it has destroyed in you everything that is not the will of God. It's kind of an intense quote there. So we see if we can explore that a bit. All right. You can read all the cookbooks in the world, an old monk once told me, but until you feel the heat of the oven, you will never bake a loaf of bread. So no book about the contemplative life can ever replace the heat of the oven. As the desert mothers and fathers famously taught, go into your cell and your cell will teach you everything. The cell is the place where one learns to pray, or rather, where one becomes an apprentice of the Spirit who prays through us. As Paul says in Romans, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with sighs too deep for words. And God, who searches the heart, knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. The contemplative life is a school of love by which the Spirit intercedes in us with sighs too deep for words. It is a life radically oriented toward God, who is radically oriented toward us. To cultivate silence and solitude, prayer and asceticism is to cultivate the love of God in one's heart. This is the mind of the Spirit and the will of God, that we come to know ourselves as other Christs in the world. This is what it means to live into our deification. And in this school of love, the cell is of central importance. In the foreword to her translation of the sayings of the Desert Fathers, Benedicta Ward observes, the aim of the monks' lives was not asceticism, but God, and the way to God was charity. The monks went without sleep because they were watching for the Lord. They did not speak because they were listening to God. They fasted because they were fed by the word of God. It was the end that mattered. The ascetic practices were only a means, and the cell was of central importance in their asceticism. The point was that unless a man could find God in this one place, his cell, he would not find him by going somewhere else. But they had no illusions about what it meant to stay in the cell. It meant to stay there in mind as well as in body. To stay there in body, but to think about the outside world was already to have left it. And so let us pray. So our second reading today comes from, chapter 5. And that is 137 to 38 for those following in the book. To stay in the cell with both mind and body is to feel the heat of the oven. But what does that mean for contemplatives living in the world? As Ward observes, the cell is more than just a physical location, it is a spiritual state. To find a cell, a place of prayerful solitude into which one can advance at regular intervals, is a great gift for those who wish to embrace the contemplative life. A room or the corner of a room with a door that can be closed, a park bench, a patch of grass under a favorite tree, a solitary pew in the back of a cavernous church where one can get lost in an otherwise bustling city. Wherever your cell might be, find it and go there. Go there often. And once you're there, remain there, even when you feel the heat of the oven, the dryness, the boredom, the distraction, the display of memories, good and painful, the waves of feelings, questions, and emotions, and yes, the demons. Just briefly as a closing prayer before our conversation this morning from Hafiz. Now is the time to know that all you do is sacred. Now is the time for you to deeply compute the impossibility that there is anything but grace. All right, so let me, I'll pause the share here. And as always, I invite your reflections or conversation. Clearly, we're moving into a different conversation than we've been having for a number of months. As I mentioned in the past, I have put the chapter specifically on prayer last, because I think a lot of the times in books on contemplative practice, it's the first or sometimes only thing we talk about. And I wanted to be able to contextualize this moving into silence or into the cell in the broader context of these other things we've since looked at, the scriptural basis, the doctrinal development of the theme of deification, the ascetical practices that we talked about, and so forth. So this is just one aspect or dimension of what it means to, strive for the contemplative life in the world, though certainly an essential one. So take a moment or two, and as questions or comments begin to arise, you have the floor. I said, go right ahead. Good morning.
In your cell, do you have a place where you play with God, or have humor, or can you expand upon a playfulness with rather than just the solitary confinement of a cell?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually in the cell, the joke is on me. A lot of the humor that arises is sort of my ability to see, or maybe being required to see my own follies and so forth. And you raise actually a beautiful question. I do think sometimes there is almost an expectation that the contemplative life or the spiritual life is this somber, austere kind of way of being. But if you really do start looking at yourself with a sort of open, honest, and inquisitive mind and heart, you can't help but see the humor. That's just part of who you are. So the capacity to be able to see who we are and admit it. Earlier in the book, that's how I define humility, not as this dour sense of how terrible I am, but really the capacity to see the truth about myself and admit it. And that means looking both at my strengths and my gifts and what I can potentially bring to the community as that Christ light sort of refracts through me in a particular way. that also then, requires us to have some humility around those areas that are just not where my particular strengths lie or what gifts that I possess, and to be able to laugh at that to some degree. And so within the cell, as we're calling it, the humor really just comes down to what it looks like for me to make an honest assessment or inventory of my own spiritual life in all of its craziness. And I would say that as we'll talk through this chapter, one of the things that we're going to look at is, in fact, I believe it's already next week, is what it means to have a cell that we carry with us, that is to say, the cell of your heart. It was St. Francis, I believe, who said the whole world is his monastery. And he really took that idea of being cloistered in a particular confined area and understood that my body is the cell. And beyond that, what I want to talk about several pages from now is the idea that the way I would understand the value of the contemplative life or the cell functioning in the life of a contemplative in the world, as opposed to the contemplative who's in the monastery, would be not to envision or model the idea that we're going in and out of the cell. So, for my 20 or 40 or whatever minutes a day, I'm in my corner of the room or meditating, and then I leave that to go out in the world. But where the cell of the heart becomes that place where, instead of conceiving the model of I'm in and out of that, what would it mean for us to really cultivate a sense of interior presence as being the cell of my heart, and instead of leaving it, invite the world into it as I make my way through the day? And does that have a different way of us understanding how we engage the world contemplatively? And it must always include humor, or else it just gets ugly fast. It's, because there's a lot there that you have to be able to confront, and the ability to laugh. I often think of my pup, who is in a sense the center of my universe, Forrest, as an example. He is so utterly transparent. He has absolutely no ability to be anything but blatantly transparent when he's manipulating me because he wants a treat and trying to be all snuggly to butter me up or whatever. The transparency of everything he does is so endearing to me. Even when I know he's in a sense being naughty, it's so clear to me that he's doing this, and he doesn't have the capacity to be subtle or to hide that. And so even when I know he's sort of being naughty, what that evokes in me is this gush of love, because in his innocence, he can't hide that. And in some ways, I feel that God looks upon us with that kind of clarity, that even when we're going wayward or trying to make up excuses why I don't need to meditate today, it just evokes a kind of endearing transparency to the divine, who sees what we're up to and just loves us in that. So we have to have some capacity to be able to laugh at ourselves and not take ourselves too seriously. Yeah, I hope that helps. Nicola, please go right ahead.
I just love the writing today. It's so very, very beautiful, and it is so helpful to me personally to be reminded with such clarity. And I just don't think I acknowledge how beautiful your writing is enough. So I wanted to take a moment to say that, but also what this triggered in me when I reflected on your writing was that when I am in a peaceful place, I have this desire to help. Mm-hmm. And I am recognizing now where that's coming from as a force. And I'm realizing that I need to learn how to work with that force. I always had that experience, but I think it was really annoying to people in a lot of ways. Perhaps my repeating myself or being obtuse or any number of things that I could have been faulted for. But now I am realizing that when you're in that cell, you are connecting to that space and that spirit, that voice that speaks. that's where that happens. And yes, you could be out in the world or talking as we are now. It's still the current of all of this. And I am just so grateful for that and the opportunity to be able to speak to it and to have this time to share that.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. And I appreciate your opening comments. I certainly have tried to write a book that is not only really speaking on behalf of the tradition, but I've tried to do that in ways that are beautiful. So I appreciate that you find it that way. And when you say that, within that silence, that capacity or desire to want to help sort of opens up. I think that's a perfect example of what I'm suggesting is the value that I was responding to Sid about taking, and we'll come to this again in a week or so, but about understanding not that I'm moving in and out of the cell, but expanding the cell to include all those around me. Because if you can hold on to a sort of core or center, it is precisely when you're in touch with that the natural flow of wanting to reach out, assist, in a sense, embody love in the world is what that is, in a pragmatic, concrete way, that you're most in touch with that flow. And it's all the other things like thoughts and judgments and excuses that start to pile on that become very transparent to God, right? These are just my excuses. But it's those things that end up restricting or hampering that flow. And I think what we're in touch with when we're in that beautiful space of solitude in that cell, be the interior or a physical place, that's when the flow of who we most naturally are, of our deepest tendency to be other oriented or outward or social oriented, begins to emerge. And if we can hold on to that throughout the day, rather than leave it behind as a cell I've left, that capacity to regain a kind of connection to that flow, I think actually is heightened. And so we cultivate the capacity to live out of that center over time. And when we notice that we've wandered far from that place, we laugh at ourselves and say, there I go again. And we find our way back.
Demons.
The demons. Yeah, that's right. That's right. They not only fight us in the cell, but they lure us out of it, don't they? So, and that's what Benedict Ward is saying, is that, to stay in the cell, but to have left it in your thoughts is already to have left it. And that's that luring, right? There's that Buddhist saying that, the hardest part about meditation is finding the bench, as it were, or finding the cushion. And that indeed, I think, is the experience for many of us. But once you get over that speed bump, or what in Sacramento I've learned they call undulations, which I find incredibly pretentious. You see signs in Sacramento saying, beware the undulations. I'm like, wow, that's intense. It's a speed bump, for God's sake. But anyway, the whole point is that those kind of speed bumps, right, that we run into are the things that slow down our journey along the way. Right. So, so notice when you're in touch with that, that flow and say, aha, now I'm in the cell. That's being in the cell. Stay there. So thanks, Nicola. It's very nice. Hi, Brother Will. How you doing? You're muted, Will. Sorry.
I know.
Oh, there you go.
After months of dealing with 2 bouts of COVID, it is so good to be with all of you this morning.
Good to be with you.
This is just a sacred place. It really is. Years ago, when I first was introduced to your new Skellig liturgy, Eucharistic liturgy, part of that is the idea of being other Christ in this world. And I've carried that in my heart. That is I'm so glad that was part of the reading today. With all the craziness that's going on in this world around us, it occurred to me just even recently, wish I hadn't taken so long to catch that, that we are that. And the contemplative life, what a gift to carry with us in the craziness around us. What a sacred place, as St. Francis did say, that the world is my cloister. So we walk through this world with that gift and that awareness that we are indeed other Christs in this world. And we don't have to be overcome by the craziness, but that our very lives can just be that presence. Nothing big and profound, but I just am so grateful to be back. And thank you, Vincent.
Well, here's to your health, Will. It's good to see you again. I'm glad you're out of the woods, because it can be a nasty sort of bout. Just a brief comment then. This is one of the beautiful images that we have in the story of Peter walking on the water with Jesus and how he begins to sink. And I think one of the beautiful metaphors behind that whole event is to ask us all the question: where are we focused? On the storm, on the chaos of the waves, or on Christ? And as long as his focus remains looking to the countenance of Jesus, as it were, and calling on his name, he can sort of rise above that chaos, be it chaos going on in your life, mental, spiritual turmoil, emotional turmoil. But the idea is, the moment we begin to lose sight of that, which in some ways is to leave the hermitage in our hearts, we can easily get consumed by those very things. So I have the icon of Peter trying to walk on water and reaching up to Christ in that sense, because it always reminds me of, whatever chaos I'm looking at, to just stay focused, just calling on that sacred name, as it were, entering that place of the heart. And it does shift how you weather storms, be they interior or external, depending on how we place our focus. So again, advocating for that, persistent repetition of your mantra or prayer word or phrase as you're throughout the day, as a way of checking in, right? A way of sort of mentally doing a little re-entrance. Where am I in relation to that inner hermitage? Have I long left it since this morning? And can I find my way back to it, expand it, invite people into it, and keep functioning out of it? And that is a lifelong practice. And sometimes you'll get it, and sometimes, a day or two will go by and you realize, wow, I've wandered pretty far. That's I always say, that's not a failure. That's just an invitation to turn back again. And so we just start again. That's the beauty of it. So thank you, Will, for that comment. Appreciate it. It's good to see you. Hey there, Carol. Good morning.
Hi. So when I was in my 20s, I had really severe anxiety, and a counselor used to have me practice like a meditation. She had me pick a place that was calm, and it was growing up in Annapolis. It was laying on a pier, listening to the ropes hitting the mast of sailboats. That's a calming, space for me. And we practiced that. And the idea was that when I felt anxiety, to remember that image, and it would make my body had been trained to relax when that image was in my brain, so that I became relaxed. And I feel like it's almost the same with this, is that we're practicing the presence of God. And then when we get out, we recall that when we start to realize we traveled far from the cell, we bring back that image again to bring us back, the brain back into that parallel journey that we're really on. So I love that. And then, but being back to the learning, I feel like we don't learn while we're in the prayer. We're just sort of like Forrest, where we're sitting in front of our master, surrendering to, and that's why I'm more of a cat than a dog, where I'm just sort of, I'll come around when I want to, rather than a dog that's like, I'll follow you everywhere. I'll follow you everywhere.
I hear that.
But the thing is I love that quote at the very beginning, that because I like the intense quotes. I think also when we're surrendering in that prayer, we're saying, let the cross burn everything out of me that's not of you, so and then we experience that outside of the cell, if we bring the cell with us, that we're able to see, aha, I see God's working in my life. He's revealing something that needed to be changed. So
that's right. And I think the idea is to have the constant summons to, I remember one writer, it might have been George Maloney in one of his books I read many, many years ago, where he talks about contemplative practice as if there's like multiple small streamlets running down a mountainside. And those are your distracted sort of activities or interests or things that you're engaged in the world, right? All these sort of streamlets. And he says with the contemplative practice, in a sense, is to merge those various streamlets. And what you end up with is a very powerful river that because you're kind of unifying your intentions around one particular thing. And so instead of having these little streamlets that have really no power and are barely a trickle, you're taking all of your disparate energies, pulling them together in a kind of centralized way, and then becoming really a force, a psychological, emotional, spiritual force for good, because you're now really concentrating everything around this one activity, as it were, of being in the hermitage, or as you call it. So there's something about, I think, that that coming back, that capacity to keep cultivating all our disparate energies into one concentrated place. Thanks, Carol. All right, Jess, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
I was actually smiling with Sid's comment about a game or humor, and I think of my experience with God as kind of like a peekaboo game. Where I'm constantly looking and then peekaboo. And then sometimes I feel like I try going back to that same place. I think, oh, I saw God here, and then maybe he's not there. But this constant searching, and my husband and I are actually doing something very unique right now. And it brings me back to when I think first was feeling the presence of God. I was in a study abroad program in France, and I took this trip, and it was just a Eurail pass, and I traveled Europe, and wherever God sent me, I was just completely trusting. And it was such an experience to be so present in that moment, because I couldn't really plan it in the way that it fell out or fell into place. It just was guided. And so, and it was just such an amazing experience that I came back and I was a different person. And that's when I met my husband, and he is an amazing individual, and he is very attuned with his spirituality and lived nomadically for 12 years. And I was like, I want that. And so together we did it. And just a few months ago, he finished his program, and I let go of my job, and we were just craving this desire to be among spiritual communities and dedicate ourselves to God. And I think I mentioned before that we started an organization where we feed the homeless, and in this pilgrimage we're really on right now, we're trying to help others as we come across different communities that need help. And so far we've stayed in 2 monasteries, and thinking of the cell that you were just talking about, and that's part of our desire, is to kind of see how different groups of people interact with one another, or how they devote themselves to God. And so we went and stayed in a monastery in Kentucky, in the Appalachian Hills on eastern Kentucky. And wow, that was an incredible experience to witness the poverty that was happening there. And this group of 7 Benedictine monks lived in this like mountainous, beautiful retreat space, but dedicated their life to working with these families and the poverty. And they held a soup kitchen, and they had a food pantry, and just helping their community all of the time. And so we definitely, connected on that purpose. But it was just so beautiful to see how that was their cell, right? The part within where it just was outreach. And the following week, which was just last week, we ended up going to Chicago, and we stayed with a group of Benedictine monks. And it was so opposite, in the sense that they had gosh, 7 offices throughout the day. It was 3 a.m. in the morning, 6 a.m. night. I mean, all throughout the day. And it was very different that everything was silent. There was no interaction with the guests, really. They chanted through all of their offices. And it was just a complete different aspect in how they find their cell. It wasn't as much with the community as much as it was just devotion. And there was something so beautiful in that as well. And it was just the contrast was just so interesting to witness. And so we're now have our plan right now. We've got 5 months ahead of us, and then who knows where life takes us. But it's been really a really beautiful experience. And I think right now I'm starting to refine this peekaboo. I'm starting to find God in that sense again, because there is just this, we've really, what's the term, when you just let go. And right now we're complete trust of God, where it's so unexpected. And the less I think that I have it planned, the more open I am to what happens and who we end up meeting along the way. And so I just wanted to share this new adventure, this new pilgrimage that my husband and I have gone into.
I think thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the, what's coming up for me as I kind of hear the story and how the different sort of monastic communities have essentially different personalities and so on, is how because one of the aspects of the book is really to ask the question, what does the contemplative life look like for those of us living in the world, right? Mm-hmm. That is not merely a kind of watered down or retrofit monasticism, but really is something that grows out of the experience of being in the world. So that we're not attempting, for example, as people in the world to pray 7 offices a day, as it were, as if that's the one or only model a contemplative can follow to really move into that place of spiritual intimacy. And I think the unique role of monasteries is something you're pointing to, which is the way I often think about practice is kind of like concentric circles. So you have your daily practice, your 2 sits a day or whatever that looks like for you. And then you might develop a monthly practice, which is, you take a Saturday, half a day and just spend that in contemplative prayer. And then you take, an annual practice, which is like a week-long retreat at a monastery where you can kind of get in touch with that peekaboo sort of thing that you tend to play throughout the year. And so to model or to develop or construct your commitment on those levels, I think helps, because to have even annually, just a week to be in silence, where we just inaugurated our first contemplative residency program here. In fact, the residents are leaving this morning. I'll need to leave actually by around 8:30 to say goodbye to them. But they are so we're trying to ask that question: how can St. Columba's become a place where residents come and kind of hold that space, and there's prayer 3 times a day, and kind of a structure, but yet also one that's intended not for monastics, but for lay people to kind of do the recharging that you and your husband are working on now. So I think, to sort of to generalize it, ask yourself, what does it look like for me to daily enter my cell? Is there something I do on a weekly or monthly level that sort of helps to ground that again and come back to that and reinforce that? And then potentially, is there something I commit to on an annual level that, again, is that third circle? And you'll find in that structure a way of really helping to maintain the cultivation throughout the year. So I wish you wonderful travels in the months ahead. Come visit us. Okay. All right, Jess. Diana, please.
Couldn't find the button, sorry. Yeah, I had a similar experience to what people are saying. I just came back from a month of travel, which we never do, but we have family in Europe. And so we were in Europe for a month. And I found, even though I could not find a minute to formally meditate, that I was carrying God's love with me, and that it was fairly easy. And having come back now, I think the reason is I didn't have I had to make trains, I had to make buses. I could hike, I could, do whatever, but be with family and all. but when I came home, then the responsibilities begin to build again, and the desire to live a purpose in life. And that's the demons, I think, for me, how to keep that cell, that presence of God, and how to let go at the same time. On vacation,
Right.
I was letting go, but at home, it's not so easy.
Well, yeah, Diana, you're raising some really good points. So maybe I'll come at it in this way. I've learned that what evil does is creates muck. Evil creates muck, so that the time you should be spending on productive, loving, concentrated efforts are spent dealing with chaos and crisis. And so beware the muck in your life, and beware those who are bringing muck into your life. One of the elements that you're raising that I think is important for us to bear in mind is this sense of what we're going to be looking at later in the chapter when I talk about Meister Eckhart's exegesis or interpretation of the Mary and Martha story in Luke's gospel, where the cloistered contemplatives throughout the world who really dominated the interpretation of that, understandably, for centuries, suddenly a Dominican like Eckhart, who had one foot in the cloister and one foot in the world, said, hold on a minute, let's not overlook Martha too quickly, and really holds her up as the model contemplative, of course, because he's also a mendicant, not a monk. In other words, he has an active ministry in the world, sort of like that first community that Jess was just talking about versus the second, where there's this real engagement, right? That's a very different model for contemplative living. So what Eckhart is saying, and we'll spend some time with this in the next few weeks, is that Martha, that in a sense, Mary represents the young contemplative who still has attachments. And what is her attachment? The bliss of sitting at the feet of Christ. In other words, the bliss of her, of that practice that she's so carefully cultivated, the contemplative practice, her meditation, that she's actually still attached to that. And while that's a beautiful thing to be attached to, Eckhart, who says the highest Christian virtue is not love, but detachment from everything, is his position, says that she still has an attachment. And as noble as that is, she's still clinging to something, and she needs to learn to let go of that to really mature like Martha. Martha, he says, on the other hand, is deeply contemplative, so much so that she knows when to leave even her meditative practice behind in order to do the most loving thing. And embodying love in the world is the end, what we call the telos, the culmination of the contemplative life. Not to sit in meditation, but to have that meditation transform us into alteri Christi, into other Christ, right? Transform us into letting that light of Christ shine through us in the world. And what he says is that Martha knows, because she's a mature contemplative, that sometimes you have to detach from the meditative practices themselves in order to reach the end that they tend toward, which is the embodiment of love. Or what he says, to recognize the dear guest Christ in your midst, which is anyone, and to know the need that's being presented to you, and in love to respond to it. Now, he would suggest that Martha did not leave her cell to do that, but invites Christ into her home, her cell, where she feeds him, cares for him, gives him rest. So when you're coming back into the world and finding the muck or the busyness begin to compile, as you're sort of describing, one of the things you want to bear in mind is, what does it mean in this context to love as love demands in this moment? And in that, that could become subtly an excuse not to meditate, because I'm doing something active and I feel better about doing something active because it gives me a noble way to avoid the heat of the oven, as we started, right? But in a sense, to know when there needs to be a balance to hold it all, but to hold it lightly, and to always allow your heart to be guided by what is the most loving thing that I'm being called to in this moment. So on the one hand, you want to be careful not to allow that to become a replacement for that meditation, but also to know when the meditation becomes so rigid that the needs of those around you are being ignored because you have this agenda that you're not allowed, that you sort of lock the door of your hermitage and you're not going out and they're not coming in. That's when you start to have to evaluate the role of your meditative practices and how they're serving to have us mature like Martha did. So I don't know if that helps, Anna, but again, just maybe a way of framing. And as we move through these readings the next few weeks, we'll have a chance to come back to that dynamic.
Thank you. That is helpful.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear it. Thank you. I loved what that monk told me. Until you feel the heat of the oven, you'll never bake a loaf of bread. I mean, the idea is, spiritual books, except mine, of course, can all serve as as sort of recipe books, as cookbooks. But you can keep reading recipes, but you're going to starve to death if you don't actually make one of the things. So at some point you have to know when to put all books down, when to put all things down, and just be present to what is. It's much more fun to read about the contemplative life and to philosophize about mysticism and so forth than to actually just be there at feeling the heat of that oven, really transforming you, as we say, the transforming fire of the heat of that oven. I often refer to my prayer bench as the hot seat for that very reason. It's where the rubber meets the road of your spiritual life. So I just would encourage you to learn as we walk through this chapter what it means to both cultivate a contemplative practice, but also to know how to hold it lightly as those of us who are contemplatives in the world, as it were. Right. Any other thoughts before we move to invitation to talk about practice that I gave for last week? And I'll also introduce and invite us to a practice which should be obvious to all of you for this week as well. Any final thoughts or comments? Oh, sure, Rosemary, go right ahead.
I just have a comment. Doesn't all contemplative prayer lead to service? That's what you're saying, Father, isn't it? And
yes.
and I think that I think an authentic contemplative that is authentic contemplative prayer life leads to service. Anyway, you want to elaborate on that a little more, but that's a thought that came to me because I see that in contemplatives around me.
Right.
That service is the result of their contemplative way of living.
Absolutely. No, it's a great point to make, and I'll try to summarize it this way. You can't climb a high mountain, isolate in a cave for 20 years, and then declare that you love humanity. You don't love humanity until you deal with humanity. And you have to deal with humanity not in a theoretical place where you're isolated from everyone for 20 years, but you have to love humanity in the muck of humanity with, people who irritate you and people who are offensive and people who hold different ideological views. I mean, that's how you learn to love. This is the whole idea of the river rock that's been made smooth from, bumping up those sharp edges against other rocks until together you kind of smooth out one another's edginess and you become softer and more pliable, I guess you could say. So indeed, the idea there is no such thing as a private Christianity. I mean, Christianity at its very core is social, is communal.
Yes, right.
There's, you can't, and we would say, therefore, and I said elsewhere in the book, even a Christian contemplative hermit monk who goes off in solitude never goes off in isolation. There is always a deep sense that you are deeply wed to the mystical body of Christ. And even in that aloneness, there is not loneliness ultimately, right? There is just a deeper connection to that greater body of which we're all members. So indeed, if our practices do not tend toward love, then we're misdirected. And love has to then therefore be embodied. So I would want to say it isn't just that contemplative practice leads to service, by which we might suggest merely behavior modification, meaning I do a nice thing because I'm supposed to, or because I feel an ethical obligation to, or because I feel some requirement to based on my reading of the gospel, but rather I serve because I discover that is my true nature. It is the true nature of the eye to serve the body by simply seeing. It is the true nature of the ear to serve the body by simply hearing, and so forth. So by discovering which particular member am I on the body of Christ, the service flows naturally from that awakening, right? That's why I come back to the idea, the humility to see the truth and admit it. If I'm an ear, I have to see the truth that I don't see. Right? I can hear really well, but I don't see too well. And if I'm an eye, I have to admit that, I can see things pretty well, but I don't hear very well. So we need one another, right? So seeing the truth of those limitations, discovering the depth of my truest identity as a member of this interconnected body leads to that the body working more perfectly, which means that every part is serving, not as behavior modification, but as a coming to one's own in terms of our deepest identity and just letting it flow from that, right? So wisdom leads to compassion. Waking up to the idea that we are all members of the same body naturally leads to compassionate action, compassionate speech, compassionate thinking, because you and I are not separate. So offending you, hurting you, oppressing you becomes as absurd as me, harming my own body in a sense, right? So that wisdom of who I am as a member on the body leads to a deeper loving connection and service that flows from being, not from a kind of forced or external behavior modification I'm trying to arrive at for the sake of my salvation. The whole debate between Catholics and Protestants over faith versus works, it took us about 500 years to figure out there's really no problem at all. There's no there. That those two things are inextricably interwoven. You don't have one without the other. You know the tree by its fruit, and so forth. So the two things. So when we imagine the contemplative life as getting out of the way, so that the light of Christ can shine through me in a particular way, right, involving my own gifts and limitations, that's a very different thing than trying to, quote unquote, apply the teachings of the Bible. That's what I'm talking about, behavior modification. I'm going to just strive to follow a set of teachings as opposed to get out of the way so Christ can simply do what Christ needs to do in me. Right. And there you have, I think, authentic communal service and the deep identity of the individual who's doing it. Does that help?
Thank you very much, Father. Thank you.
Well,
and that's the difference with the disciples. Don't you think that after Christ rose, they changed entirely? They were like, you laugh at them because of the silly things, but then as soon as they were transformed, they were on fire, and moving with God's love rather than their own instinct. They had gotten out of the way of themselves. Right?
Yeah. And that apparently was, as I think I've mentioned, Mother Teresa's morning prayer, get me out of your way. I mean, that's simple. And if we can kind of and whenever we're in a situation that's contentious or difficult or challenging, to just come back to that, get me out of your way. What is the loving thing to do in this situation? I think we are guided to better ends. Okay, Nora, I'll take your question last, and then we'll take a few minutes to look at practice. Go right ahead. Good to see you.
Thank you, Father. It's good to see everyone here and you. I'm reading a new recipe book, and I have a new spiritual hot seat. So it has to do with the products of transformation. It's Thomas Keating's A Search for the Unknowable. And he talks about transformation, and he didn't name it products, but I've named it products myself because, why am I wanting to be transformed? And he puts it very, very well, I think. He says, we begin to see the goodness in everyone, the connection of everything, and the wisdom of creativity and redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And I somehow that just stuck in my mind, and it gives me a goal without wanting to have great expectations. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
So, and my spiritual hot seat has become this door I have on my deck. I live on the third floor of the top floor of this building, and this door goes to nowhere, but it's a wooden door. I mean, it's there because sometimes I have to bring things up on an electric winch I have. So anyway, I put my feet up on this door and look at the sky. And it's just, and that's where I meditate. It somehow, for this time, it's my legs are raised above my heart, which is a good thing. And it's, it's a kind of a double duty thing. But really, the vastness of the sky in the early morning is so inspiring to me that God really feels close. And I realize that I have to, my for any transformation to occur, I have to allow myself to be loved by God. I can't do anything without that.
Yeah.
That's my.
Thank you for that, Nora.
That's it.
Well, and it sounds like, one of the beautiful things is you found that sacred or that thin place that you're calling your hermitage, and it's that dome, under that dome, and with your feet raised and so forth. This is what is, find that spot that both brings you awe, right? Or brings you into that place of quiet and so on. And for those of you who are at all watching the new pictures that are coming back from the new telescope, it is just absolutely, I'm just gobsmacked at what I'm seeing. And I recently saw just a little 9-minute YouTube video, and which tries to help us comprehend the vastness of the universe. It is absolutely ridiculous. So the kind of conclusion is, here's the analogy they give. Imagine a light bulb, and what we have as the observable universe is everything within that light bulb. And that light bulb is sitting on Pluto, and we are not able to see anything beyond the perimeter of that light bulb, which we're inside of. But the rest of the universe comparatively is the rest of Pluto. I mean, if you just begin to understand that inside that light bulb, we're already looking back, 14 billion light years, and that's all inside the light bulb, and that's all we can see, and that there's still this whole Pluto to be explored. I mean, it is absolutely staggering. And the way that this video just sort of runs you through, starting with simple distance between Moon and Earth, starts to help you expand. But then you hear numbers like sextillion and multiple trillions, and it just doesn't mean anything anymore. So he tries to put it in these sort of more graphic terms where you can picture the size of a light bulb compared to an entire planet and begin to get some conceptualization of just how ridiculously small and insignificant we are on some level, and the vastness. It's just beautiful and profound. So I can see why you would be drawn to the sky as the great temple.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, thank you.
So you're welcome, Nora. Always good to hear from you. I'm just going to close here briefly. I wanted to call this up just to make sure I get this out to you all before we wrap up for this morning. So here's my suggestion by way of a contemplative practice. Reflect on the place you call your cell, where is it, what's in it, and what's sacred about it. So somewhat what Nora has already kind of led us into. What's your cell? What's there? Special candle, icon? What does it look like and why is it special? I would love to hear about people's sacred places. So that might be something we could look up when we're together. Okay, and last week's practice, just to kind of give us a sense of that, if anybody would like to respond, was to ask who needs your accompaniment, your witness, your vigilance, and an invitation to be present to them in a specific way. We were talking about the last ascetical practice I talked about, which is keeping vigil. So if anybody would like to take a moment to respond to that, we have about 10 minutes, and then we'll go, David.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This didn't just start with last week, but my answer to that is Ukraine. And the work that we did at the end of the last chapter about keeping vigil is an important word about it. And in our community, retirement community here, we have a group that gathers every Monday at 2:00 to just keep vigil for and pray for Ukraine. And that's been very keen for me. But there's another part of the story which is sweet, I think. And that is also when you have a concern like that, there's a need to what financially am I being asked to do to address this issue. And I don't know if you know, but in Lviv, Ukraine, there's a group of icon makers. And if I was going to do something financially, it was important that it be somehow with a real person and a name and someone that I could connect with. And so if you go to, if you can Google Icon Arts Ukraine, there's a lovely group of maybe 25 icon makers. Some of them really push the boundaries, but are doing beautiful work. But as part of my journey of being with those people and with that particular group of people, that icon makers, I was able to look at their work and then finally decided to purchase an icon of the Holy Family, which is very traditionally done with the egg temper and gesso on wood, etc.
Sure.
And also to have it be more personal because of correspondence and email that I could have with the people there in that little icon makers group. So all that is part of the fact that I think I'm continually called to be keeping vigil for Ukraine and for the people of Ukraine in this. And then it was enriched by having a little personal connection with a real person. And now this artwork, this icon is in my home, and that connects me with them every day. So the short answer to the question is Ukraine, but I just wanted to share a little bit of that story with you.
Well, really beautiful, David. I mean, that whole cycle of not just sort of in this generalized way praying for Ukraine, but actually making that personal connection, right? And then to have that sort of come full cycle with actually having one of their icons, which connects you further. It's quite beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. There's, I think there might even be a sermon in there somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Ruth, I think your hand is, oh, there you are.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to just share real briefly. I selected my next door neighbor who is 89 years old, and I had learned this spring from her granddaughter who was visiting how lonely she gets, and I had tried every week to go over there and just play games with her, just spend a couple of hours playing board games. And this summer things got busy. Both my dogs are older. They had been sick. My grandkids were here more. And I let Mary Beth fall off my radar until you put this challenge up. And this week I returned to that practice of going to play games. So then I had both grandsons over to spend the night, and my little Sheltie has been very ill. She's made multiple trips to the vet. And so here was that voice in my head saying, you know, you've got too many demands on you. You've got the kids, you've got the Sheltie. And I remembered my commitment to the practice. And I said, okay, we can do this. So kids, Sheltie, and I go next door and spend about 3 hours playing Chutes and Ladders with Mary Beth. And what really hit home was how, instead of letting those different needs to keep vigil, to be present, separate me from any of them, just simply combining them brought so much joy to all of us. The sick Sheltie sat in Mary Beth's lap the whole time we played the silly games. And I just realized how easily I let obstacles get in the way of doing that. Mm-hmm. And how much I get out of not letting those obstacles come into play. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And I think that ties together a lot of the comments we heard today, just about, you know, what does it mean to keep returning? In his, Lev Gillett, otherwise known as a monk of the Eastern Church, has written beautiful books on, for example, the Jesus Prayer. And he has this one line that I always sort of stuck out for me, that when we forget, or when we don't maintain a practice, or when we sort of forget to hold our prayer in mind, he says, when we recall that again, or when we return to that, he first says it's like just a returning to Christ, or rather, I think he says something to the effect where that in that moment, Christ returns to us, or rather we return to Christ who's been there all along. And it's just this beautiful sense of that vigilance. And every time I sit before my icon that I have here, which is a beautiful icon of Christ, lover of humanity, as it's called, there is a sense that all the time when I'm running around throughout the day doing what I'm doing, that icon just sits and gazes and waits my return, right? There's just this constant fidelity of Christ who is forever waiting for my return to that place, whether that's physically coming back before the icon, or of course, just coming back to the truth of the Christ that icon points to. So Christ just is this perpetual loving gaze watching over us all the time. And then we just have to be consciously bring ourselves present, but Christ never goes anywhere. And Lev Gillett really puts that beautifully in his book on the Jesus Prayer. So thank you for sharing that, Ruth. I appreciate it. So my residents, after a week here, are packing up and needing to go. So I have to run to be with them and bid them off to the airport and so on. But I do look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, as always, for all of your comments and conversation and sharing. As always, I very much appreciate it. So as you go out into the world, remember to take your hermitage with you. Invite all around you into that beautiful, blessed presence of Christ that you hold in your hearts, and go in the peace of that same Christ, in the name of the Three in One and One in Three. Amen. Good to see you all.